A chair leg scraped tile like a match striking. Not fire. Just that sharp warning sound that made Cale Ward's eyes lift, without his head moving. Saturday meant pancakes. That was Mia's rule, delivered with the clean certainty of a 7-year-old who believed rules existed to keep the world from wobbling. The waitress set the plate down in front of her. Syrup shone in the window light. Cale's coffee steamed. The booth vinyl stuck faintly to his forearm when he shifted. Mia reminded him it was Saturday, which meant pancakes. Cale confirmed the rule. She set Captain on the table between the sugar caddy and the ketchup bottle. The stuffed rabbit's fur had faded to oatmeal. One ear bent. The other had 2 crooked stitches where Mia had fixed him. She patted his head once, solemn, putting him on guard duty. Cale's watch ticked when he reached for his cup. Plain face, scratched bezel, nothing that looked like a story. His phone lay face down beside the napkins. Silent. He liked it that way. Marlo's diner carried its usual soundtrack. Griddle hiss, forks clicking, low voices, the thin bell over the front door. Lemon Cleaner fought fryer grease and didn't win. The place was bright in a tired way. Familiar. Safe enough if you didn't ask for more. The scrape had come from 3 booths down. Kate Ross sat alone with her jacket still on, like she hadn't meant to stay. 2 men hovered at her table without sitting. One leaned in, elbow planted on the seat across from her. The other stood in the aisle with his hip angled, making the narrow passage narrower. Cale saw their geometry before he heard their words. The aisleman's boot hooked Kate's chair leg so it couldn't slide back. The leaning man smiled while his knuckles stayed white. Mia followed Cale's gaze. Her small hand landed on his forearm, warm and insistent. She spoke quietly, asking him to help her. Please help her. In Mia's world, adults stopped bad things when they saw them. That expectation hit harder than the chair scrape. Cale stayed seated for one more breath, long enough to feel the weight of choosing. Kate's eyes flicked to the door, then to the window, then to nowhere. She wasn't looking for rescue. She was looking for space. He stood and moved into the aisle like he was headed for a refill. No announcement. No chair screech. Just a man in a diner stepping into a line that didn't belong to him. He stopped at Kate's table close enough that the men had to acknowledge him. Hands open, voice flat. He told them to step back. The aisle man laughed, loud enough to recruit attention, and tried to turn it into a joke. Cale didn't answer. He watched shoulders. He watched weight shift. He watched the leaning man's hand come up toward his chest, casual and possessive, like touching something that belonged to him. It took less than 10 seconds. Cale caught the wrist as it came. Fingers closed, not hard, just complete. He turned the hand palm up and rotated the joint into a place it didn't want to go. The smile collapsed into a sharp intake of breath. Cale stepped in, close, and guided the man down into the booth with controlled force. Vinyl squealed. A plate skittered. Coffee sloshed across the table in a dark arc. The aisle man lunged. Too late. Cale didn't square up. He shifted 1 foot back, just enough to steal distance, and hooked the man's ankle at the moment his weight committed forward. The man's balance went. Dilamet gnei. Then, shoulder. A dull, airless thump. Cale's palm pinned the wrist that reached again, keeping it on the floor. No punches. No chase. Leverage and timing. Then stillness. For a breath, the diner stayed itself. Griddle hiss, radio murmur behind the counter, the bell above the door trembling in its frame. Then the room remembered people were in it. Someone gasped. Someone swore. A laugh cut off wrong, like a tape snagging. Phones rose. Cale heard it as much as he saw it. Screen taps. A camera beep. The thin chirp of a video starting. One screen caught his face in the overhead light. Another aimed at Kate. Another held high over a booth like a periscope, already recording, already trimming the moment into a story. That shift landed heavier than the takedown. The incident had left his hands and entered everybody else's. Kate stood, slow. Her hands shook. Her voice came thin but clear as she told them to stop. Mia had stood too. She clutched Captain, bent ear pressed against her cheek. Her eyes were huge, wet, fixed on Cale like she was waiting for him to make the world understandable again. Cale went back to their booth without rushing and sat, careful, like sudden movement might cause a second wave. He watched Mia's fingers around Captain's fur and asked her to breathe with him, in and out, slow enough to be a game. Mia copied him. Her shoulders dropped a fraction. Captain's ear fluttered with her breath. Behind the counter, the waitress already had a phone to her ear. She called for police, voice tight. Cale paid cash. Routine even when the room tilted. The check came with a printed receipt still warm from the machine. He picked it up, folded it once, then again, crisp, and slid it into his pocket until he felt the paper's edge and knew it was there. Proof of place and time, a small anchor he could hold. His phone vibrated once against the tabletop. A notification, nothing urgent. He flipped it over without looking. Screens were not his friend right now. Kate's gaze found him across the aisle. Gratitude tried to form and didn't quite. What she managed was shock and stubborn anger holding her upright. She thanked him like the words cost her. Cale nodded once. Minimal. Deaths made stories stick. Outside, Siren Rose, still distant but coming. In the diner window, Cale caught his reflection layered over the street. Oastlangas, over the lifted phones. He had built his quiet life out of small rules and soft toys and Saturday pancakes. It had taken less than 10 seconds to break the line. Now the record existed. Now the narrative belonged to whoever held the cleanest angle. Cale's eyes kept tracking the screens as if they were exits he could no longer use. His hand settled on the pocket with the receipt, then dropped. Paper moved faster than people once it had a reason to. The first cruiser arrived before the siren finished climbing. It swung into Marlo's lot and stopped hard, nose angled across two spaces like it expected someone to run. Red and blue light strobed across the diner windows, turning faces into quick masks. Mia flinched at the flash. Her fingers dug into Cale Ward's jacket as he guided her through the door. Captain was pinned under her arm, the rabbit's head shoved against her ribs like a shield. Cale didn't rush. Rush made a child panic and made an adult look guilty. He stepped into the parking lot and let the air hit his face, cold and sharp with exhaust and hot asphalt. The griddle smell followed them out, stubborn as a memory. He told Mia to keep her eyes on him. Small rules. Same as always. Mia nodded too fast. He set Captain properly in her hands, the way she liked, and closed her fingers around the rabbit's middle. He asked her to count the rabbit's buttons. Mia swallowed and started whispering. 1, 2, 3. Cale positioned himself so the strobe hit his back instead of her face. He kept his palm on her shoulder, light pressure, a reminder that he was there and solid. A radio crackled nearby, words swallowed by static. A car door slammed. Footsteps crossed gravel. Everything sounded louder outside, like the world had been turned up. An officer called for him and told him to step over. Cale raised one hand in a slow, empty gesture and moved exactly as asked, never more than a few steps from Mia. Another officer spoke to Kate Ross near the curb. Someone had draped a blanket over Kate's shoulders. She looked smaller inside it, but she stayed on her feet. The officer in front of Cale held a notepad. Young, clean uniform, a face still surprised by real fear. He asked what happened. Cale kept it short, factual, no adjectives that could be argued with later. Two men approached her. They blocked her chair. One reached for him. He restrained him. The other came in and went down. The officer asked if he'd seen weapons. Cale said no. Anyone hurt? Bruise. Maybe a sprain. No knives. No shots. Behind the cruiser, a bystander's voice rose, excited now that danger had turned into story. The man waved his phone and said he had it on video. Another person stepped forward with their own screen, already replaying the clip. The speaker tinny, the audio peaking, the moment getting louder with every replay. Cale kept his eyes on the officer, but the sight of those screens tightened something behind his ribs. The record was multiplying. A second officer cut in, voice clipped, asking for witness names and who the woman was. Cale gave her name, Kate Ross. The officer looked up, checking whether he knew her. Cale kept it simple. He'd learned it today. The whisper count continued behind him, thin but steady. 4, 5. The officer's radio chirped again, sharper. He turned his head to listen, voice dropping. Cale caught fragments that didn't belong to a normal parking lot. Base, liaison, public affairs. Not explained. Not for him. The officer faced him again and produced a clipboard. He wanted a signature confirming the statement. Cale scanned the page quickly, eyes moving like they had their own motor. Simple language, permanent boxes. He signed where indicated. Clean? No. Extra marks. He asked, once, about the child nearby without naming her like she was evidence. The officer said they weren't going to question her. She was a kid. Cale filed it as a promise that could be forgotten later. On the curb, Kate's voice rose for the first time, thin and fierce. She told the officer she wanted to file. I want to file. On record. The phrase settled heavy. A record was a door that only swung one way. The lot filled with small procedural motions. An officer asked for dates of birth. Another took photos of scraped tile dust on a shoe. Someone wrote down license plates. Paper moved. Pens scratched. The strobe kept flashing like it was trying to burn the moment into everyone's retinas. One officer started collecting videos with tired patients that didn't match the adrenaline in the bystanders. Cale spoke once, stripped down to the useful part. He told them to get the original files, not forwarded edits. The first copy would be the cleanest. The young officer blinked, then nodded like he'd been handed a checklist. When Cale was finally waved off, it was almost casual, like the story ended where it began, like paper didn't follow you home. He buckled Mia into the passenger seat. Captain flopped sideways in her lap, absurdly soft against the hard plastic buckle. Mia's hand stayed tight on the rabbit's fur. She asked if they could go. Cale said they were going. As he pulled out, Marlo shrank in the mirror, still bright, still ordinary. The red-blue flashes faded into daylight. Mia watched the last strobe disappear and let out a breath she'd been holding. she asked, in the small way a child asked whether they were helping. Cale looked at the road ahead and thought about signatures and copies and angles. He didn't give her an adult speech. He gave her the true thing he could say out loud. They were writing it down. He drove on, knowing he was on record now, and unable to shake the question that had started in the diner and followed him into the open street. Were they here to help? Or were they here to lock them down? The knock came on the third beat. Not frantic, not friendly. Wood answering wood with steady pressure that expected compliance. Cale Ward was already awake. The house was dim and cold, the kitchen clock a green blur. He crossed the hall without lights, bare feet finding the one creaking board and avoiding it. Outside, an engine idled low and smooth. Not the uneven cough of a neighbor warming a truck. Controlled, patient. The note held steady, like a held breath. The knock came again. Same tempo. Cale stopped at the entry and looked through the peephole. A man stood under the porch light, clean-shaven, hair cut close, dark jacket over a collared shirt. Hands empty, visible. A second shape sat in the driver's seat of the car at the curb, face lost in windshield glare. Another knock, and the porch light buzzed faintly. Cale unlatched the door but left the chain on. He opened it a few inches. The man addressed him by name, like reading a label, and asked to come in. Cale stayed in the doorway. It was early. He didn't invite strangers into a sleeping house. The man said they would keep it brief. Cale stepped onto the porch and pulled the door mostly shut behind him. The chain clicked. A small boundary. The man didn't comment. He held a thick folder tucked under his arm, corners sharp. Cale asked what he wanted. The man said last night didn't stay local. It crossed into a system that kept going after the diner lights turned off. Cale said he gave a statement. The man's tone stayed neutral as he delivered the turn, clean and practiced. Last night woke something that was supposed to stay asleep. The engine at the curb idled on. A metronome. Cale's eyes went to the folder. He asked if this was about the diner. The man said it was not only about the diner. Certain names and patterns drew attention, not because of the exact move Cale made last night, but because the file attached itself to who he had been. Cale kept his hands loose. He said the man had the wrong person. The man said they didn't run on guesses. Quiet was stable. Quiet was good. Last night wasn't quiet. A floorboard creaked behind the door. Cale called for Mia, not loud. A small rustle, then her voice, sleepy and worried, saying she was there. The chain shifted. Mia pushed the door from inside with the confidence of a child who didn't understand thresholds. Cale caught it before it opened wide. Her face appeared in the crack, hair tangled, eyes too alert for the hour. Captain was tucked under her arm, the rabbit's worn fur pressed to her chest. The man's gaze dropped to the toy. Assessment? Quick and clean. He greeted her by name. Mia's fingers tightened on Captain's bent ear. She didn't answer. Cale told her to go back to her room and close the door. Mia hesitated, then vanished down the hall. The door shut. The house went quiet again, but not soft. The man noted she had been at the diner. Cale said a lot of people had. The man replied that a child being present changed how problems got handled. That was why he was here in person. He opened the folder. Cardboard rasped. Pages slid. Staples whispered. Inside were headings and dates that didn't belong to last night. Black blocks of redaction. At the top, Cale Ward. Beneath it, Status. Reactivated. The word hit like a cold hand at the back of Cale's neck. The man said this wasn't an arrest. Think of it as containment. Cale asked what it was containment from. The man said escalation. Optics. The wrong people taking interest. Then, he gave the time pressure, the part meant to move the body even if the mind resisted. 48 to 72 hours. After that, it left this level. More paper, more eyes, less context. Cale read enough to see the shape of it. Old entries, old classifications, the kind of file that didn't die, just slept. The man reduced it to plain English, no speechifying. Each step up added signatures. Each signature reduced the chance of a headline. Truth was not the priority. Containment was. Cale asked what the man was asking him to do. The man closed the folder with a soft snap. He wanted cooperation. Quiet. No calls that made this bigger. No encouragement for Kate Ross to turn it into something public. He offered the line that sounded helpful but carried a leash. Help us help you. Cale asked what happened if he didn't. The man said the system protected itself. It did it through life. Stability. Benefits. He let his gaze lift once toward the house, just enough to make the implication real. The engine at the curb idled on, patient as paper. The man stepped back, polite enough to look reasonable to a neighbor peeking through blinds. He said he would follow up that afternoon. Before he turned away, he slid one page forward inside the open folder. A sticky note clung to it. A number beneath. A short instruction above it, printed like it had been copied from a template. Only call if. Cale didn't touch it. He didn't need to. He could feel how the note wanted to live in his pocket. The man walked to the car. The driver didn't look over. The engine note barely changed as they pulled away, smooth as a decision already made. Cale stayed on the porch with the folder's weight still in his eyes. The porch light buzzed. The air smelled like wet wood. Behind him, Mia's door opened a crack. Captain's ear appeared first, then Mia's eye. Mia asked for him, small and careful. Cale didn't answer, with comfort he couldn't guarantee. He looked down at the folder again, at reactivated, at the sticky note with the half line, and at the window, printed into the paper like a countdown. 48 to 72 hours. Cale Ward's phone lit up on the counter and vibrated once, then stopped. Unknown number. He watched it the way he watched a door latch after dark. In the living room, Mia's cartoon murmured at a volume set just under noise. Captain sat slumped on the couch, one bent ear aimed at the television like he was listening too. The phone vibrated again. This time it rang. Cale didn't answer on the first ring. He wiped his hands on a dish towel he didn't need and listened to the house. Refrigerator fan. The faint tick of his watch. The quick little hitch in Mia's laugh when she noticed he'd gone still. He picked up and gave his name. A breath. Wind on the line. Then a woman's voice. Steady, but thin at the edges. Kate Ross. From the diner. Cale said he remembered. Traffic hummed behind her, constant and distant, like she'd chosen to stand outside rather than let walls hear this. Kate told him she went in that morning. She filed. Cale felt his throat tighten, then let it go. Filing meant wait. It meant timelines that didn't bend, and people who treated paper like truth. He said, okay. Kate kept going. Faster now. They'd asked her to choose. Keep it inside or put it on the formal track. The way they said it made inside sound kinder. Quieter. Cale leaned one hip against the counter and kept the hallway in his peripheral vision, a straight line to Mia. He asked what she chose. Kate paused once, then answered with the kind of firmness that didn't need decoration. Unrestricted. Cale let a breath out through his nose. He didn't praise her. Praise turned choices into symbols, and symbols got handled. He gave her the thing she could use. All right. Kate admitted she was scared. She brought up his kid, like she could see the cost, even through a phone line. Cale told her she didn't drag him anywhere. Last night did. In the living room, Mia shifted on the couch and Captain slid an inch. Mia's head appeared around the corner, checking. Cale lifted 2 fingers. Stay. She retreated. Kate said they'd explain the quiet option as help that stayed contained. The other option meant it got written up properly and pushed forward whether anyone liked it or not. Cale kept his reply short, shaped like a tool instead of a speech. 1 lane stays behind closed doors, he said. The other makes it official. Official means people have to answer in writing. Kate said she wanted that. She wanted it to stop being treated like her personal inconvenience. Cale's fingers tapped once against the counter edge, a small fidget he didn't allow himself often. Then we keep it clean, he said. Kate asked what that meant. Cale answered with actions, not ideals. No side calls, no private handling, no soothing offers that couldn't be proved later. Write down every contact, date, and time, what they asked for. If someone wanted something, make them send it. Kate's breath hitched. Someone already called her. Not police. A calm voice, supportive, offering options. Cale heard the shape of a hand on a steering wheel. That's steering, he said. It won't sound like a threat. It'll sound like comfort. Kate said she didn't know if she could handle a whole chain knowing her name. Cale didn't tell her she'd be fine. He didn't know that. He stayed in the parts he could actually touch. You chose a lane, he said. Don't wobble. Wobble is where they label you uncertain. Kate went quiet, then asked about the videos from the diner. Cale kept it tight. Don't post them. Make copies. Keep the originals. If someone asks for the file, I don't hand over a trimmed clip. The first copy was the cleanest. Kate said he sounded like he'd done this before. Cale's eyes went to the phone screen. The number. The fact that it existed. He said he'd watched systems protect themselves. Kate exhaled. She said she didn't want to be a headline. Cale told her not to talk to anyone who wanted one. No interviews. No messages she couldn't keep. Nothing said in a moment that would live forever in someone else's folder. A car honked in her background. Kate shifted. She said they warned her that if she went unrestricted, it would notify people who didn't like being notified. Cale pictured a porch light in a folder and a word that didn't belong in a quiet life. He said that sounded accurate. Kate's voice softened, but the decision didn't. She was doing it anyway. Cale felt something clean and reluctant in his chest. Respect, stripped of warmth. Okay, he said again, and this time it carried weight. He pulled a small notebook from a drawer and wrote 1 line in block letters. Kate Ross. Unrestricted. He added the time. The pen dragged faintly on the paper, a dry sound that made it real. Kate asked, almost whispering, if he was going to get in trouble. Cale looked toward the living room, toward Mia's socks on the rug, toward Captain's bent ear aimed at the TV. Trouble had already arrived. It didn't need his permission. He didn't sermonize. He set a boundary. He told her he wasn't going to do anything reckless. He was going to do everything documented. Kate thanked him. Cale didn't say you're welcome. He gave her the one move that would matter later. If they offer you the quiet option again, he said, ask for it in writing. Kate made a small, surprised sound, like she hadn't realized she was allowed to demand that. When the call ended, Cale set the phone down and stared at it as if it might move on its own. Mia's cartoon kept chirping. The contrast made him feel like he had one foot in each world. He went to the couch and sat beside Mia. She leaned into him without asking. Captain's fur brushed his wrist. Mia looked up. Daddy, are we okay? Cale kept his voice steady. He told her they were okay. Then he added, the only part that mattered. They were going to be careful. And the question stayed under his ribs, sharp as a staple. Careful against what? Exactly, when the rules themselves could be turned into a hand on your shoulder. Cale's phone buzzed at 8:03 with a message that didn't ask. 9:30. The diner. Brief check-in. No name attached. Just a number that knew his schedule. He arrived early anyway. Parked 2 rows back with a view of the entrance and the lot. Winter sun turned the windshield into a pale mirror. He wiped it once with his sleeve and watched reflections rearrange. His watch ticked. His phone stayed in his pocket. Inside, the diner smelled the same as always. Coffee, fryer oil, lemon cleaner losing a slow fight. The bell over the door rang thin and familiar, and Cale felt how that sound now carried a second meaning. Not welcome, not routine, a marker. He chose a booth with sightlines. Door, counter mirror, restrooms, windows. He ordered coffee and didn't touch it. He watched the minute hand move. He watched who looked too long. At 9:28, a man walked in and didn't scan for a seat. Mid-40s, clean coat, hair neat. The kind of face that learned to smile without moving the eyes. He crossed straight to Cale's booth and slid in across from him without asking. He addressed Cale by name and identified himself as a liaison. He placed a paper cup on the table between them. The lid clicked softly. It smelled like coffee made for appearance, not drinking. Cale didn't reach for it. He said the man wasn't local police. The liaison agreed. Polite. He said they preferred to keep matters like this inside the family. Cale kept his voice flat. The liaison had shown up at his house. The liaison's smile held. He said they checked on his welfare. A public incident became a public record. Public records invited attention. Attention invited complications. Cale watched the liaison's hands. No rings. Nails trimmed. He moved with the comfort of someone used to forms. Cale named the complication he cared about. His daughter being flagged at school. The liaison didn't blink. He said schools ran on policies and paperwork, and sometimes paperwork kicked back when it sensed risk. A form rejected, a note in a file, a phone call that sounded routine. Funny timing, Cale said. The liaison gave a small, apologetic tilt of his head that didn't commit to anything. He said they were trying to prevent escalation. For everyone. He slid an envelope across the table. Paper on vinyl made a whisper. This is a proposed path forward. Cale didn't touch it yet. He let it sit, like a baited hook. The liaison spoke like a man explaining weather. There were multiple ways an incident could be handled after the fact. The easiest way was quiet. Quiet meant fewer people, Fewer mistakes, fewer surprises. Cale finally opened the envelope and read. The first page looked like relief. No further action. Matter resolved. Language that promised his life could go back into its lane. Then the fine print arrived. Voluntary cooperation. Agreement not to discuss related matters. A clause discouraging assisting anyone else involved. A line that shifted blame subtly toward civilian interference, turning his hands into the problem the system needed. Cale looked up. You want me to be the reason this stays contained. The liaison's smile didn't move, but his eyes sharpened for a second, then relaxed. He said they wanted Cale to avoid becoming a catalyst. Cale repeated the word once, tasting it. The liaison nodded. He said Cale did a good thing at the diner, stopped a bad moment from getting worse. Now, he should stop it from becoming bigger than it needed to be. Cale watched the waitress pass behind the liaison with a pot of coffee, her eyes trained on not noticing. This was how pressure worked. In bright places with menus and pancakes, and nothing that looked like a threat. Cale asked what happened to Kate Ross. The liaison's tone stayed soft. Kate would get support. Quite support. Options that protected privacy. Help that stayed contained if she chose the quiet lane. Cale didn't argue the idea. He pointed at the fact. She chose unrestricted. The liaison's smile thinned by a millimeter. He said that lane triggered notice. Notice pulled in people who didn't like being notified. And once enough eyes were on something, outcomes started getting set for reasons that weren't truth. Cale said that was the point. The liaison leaned forward slightly, just enough to change the air. He addressed Cale again. Still, mild. Cale's pension was a file. His coverage was a file. His daughter's enrollment was a file. Files could stay clean or get messy depending on how many hands touched them. There it was. Not a threat. An inventory. The liaison offered it like advice. The system set outcomes based on what looked stable. If this stayed a local incident, handled appropriately, the stability stayed intact. If it grew into a broader narrative, the system would protect stability in other ways. Cale let the words settle. He could feel the trap teeth. Safety offered in exchange for silence. Silence framed as cooperation. Cooperation framed as voluntary. Cale asked what the liaison wanted him to sign. The liaison pushed the pen from the table caddy toward him like it was nothing. The pen clicked once as it rolled. The smell of ink rose faintly, clean and permanent. A statement acknowledging that public disorder increased because third parties intervened. An agreement to refrain from further involvement. Cale pictured Mia in a school office, feet not touching the floor, Captain on her lap. He pictured a screen that said pending. This was the same pressure, just dressed for a booth. He didn't pick up the pen. If I sign, he said, you can tell your chain I was the problem. The liaison's smile returned. Pacient. He said if Cale signed, they could protect his stability, and they could protect hers. Cale folded the document back into the envelope and slid it toward the liaison untouched. No. The liaison's expression remained polite. He told Cale to think carefully. People regretted making this harder. Cale stood. The booth vinyl squealed, loud in the thin quiet between them. Heads turned briefly, then looked away. Cale said he wasn't making it harder. He was refusing to be used. He walked out with the bell ringing behind him and felt the winter air hit his face like a reset. In the lot, his car sat where he left it. Ordinary metal. Ordinary keys. He started the engine and watched the diner in the rearview mirror until it became just another bright rectangle. The question followed him out, simple and sharp. How many quiet resolutions were just traps waiting for the right signature? Captain made the wrong sound in Mia's hands. They were in the living room after dinner, the house dim except for a lamp in the corner and the blue spill of a muted TV. Mia sat cross-legged on the rug with Captain in her lap, running his bent ear through her fingers like a habit. Cale Ward stood at the sink, rinsing plates that were already clean, listening to the small domestic noises he'd built his life around. Mia squeezed Captain's belly to make him talk. The rabbit's worn stuffing compressed, then rebounded. A click answered from inside the fabric. Small. Hard. Wrong. Mia stopped mid-squeeze. Her eyes lifted to Cale, wide with the kind of guilt that arrived before logic. She asked if she broke him. Cale turned off the faucet. The kitchen went quiet, except for his watch ticking and the refrigerator fan. He wiped his hands once on a towel and crossed the room. Captain looked ordinary. Faded fur, crooked stitches, a toy that smelled faintly of Mia's shampoo. But when Cale took him and pressed lightly along the belly seam, the click came again, sharper, like plastic tapping a spoon. Captain wasn't supposed to have anything rigid inside. Cale kept his voice level and told Mia he would check. He carried the rabbit to the kitchen table where the light was brighter and the surface was clean. He washed his hands. Soap. Rinse. Dry. Then he came back to Captain without rushing, as if speed itself could smear something. Mia hovered in the doorway, toes on tile, silent. Cale didn't tell her to leave. He couldn't explain why without scaring her, but he also couldn't let her think she'd done something wrong. He turned Captain over and found Mia's newest stitches, thread a different shade, knots lumpy with haste. He slid a fingernail under the knot and eased it loose. The thread dragged softly, one loop at a time, the seam yielding without tearing. Captain's belly opened enough for 2 fingers. Cale reached into the stuffing and felt cloth, then the dry crumble of foam, then something flat and smooth that didn't belong. He paused, breathing steady, then pinched and drew it out. A micro SD card sat in his palm, black and small, with a sliver of white tape on the back. Someone had written on the tape in tight letters, KR. Cale didn't move for a full second. He looked at the letters until they stopped being ink and became a link. Mia asked what it was. Cale told her it was something that got inside. He set the card on a clean paper towel like the table might absorb it. KR. Kate Ross. His mind ran back through the diner, bodies shifting. Mia hugging Captain hard against her chest while phones rose. He couldn't see the hand that did it. The tape made it intentional. He went to the junk drawer and took a small zip bag. He used the paper towel to lift the card without putting his skin on it and slid the towel and card into the bag. He wrote the date and time on a sticky note and pressed it to the plastic, then wrote the same time in his notebook, slower, as if speed could be argued with later. Mia's voice tightened. She asked if they were in trouble. Cale crouched so his eyes were level with hers. He told her no, firm. She didn't do anything wrong. Mia hugged her arms to her chest like she'd lost something. Captain lay on the table now, seam open, stuffing exposed. Cale pulled the rabbit closer, away from her hands, and smoothed the fur like he was calming an animal. He kept the next line low, more for himself than for her. If I handle this wrong, he murmured, it won't hold. His phone buzzed on the counter. One vibration, then another. A text from an unknown number. We should talk. Cale didn't open it. He didn't need to. He turned his head toward the front window and listened. Outside, through the blinds, an engine idled. Low, smooth, patient. The same controlled sound he'd heard before the knock, the kind that didn't belong to a neighbor. The note dipped once, then steadied again, like a driver shifting weight in a seat. Cale moved to the window and lifted the blind a finger width. A dark sedan sat 2 houses down, angled slightly as if ready to roll. A driver's silhouette faced forward, not looking at his house, which was how watchers tried to look harmless. Cale let the blind fall. He checked the back door lock without thinking, thumb testing the deadbolt twice. Then he checked the front chain, the small click sounding louder than it should have in a quiet kitchen. He didn't tell Mia why he was moving that way. He just moved. Mia edged closer, hands clasped. She asked if the card was bad. It's important, Cale said. Important means we treat it carefully. He kept his tone gentle, like explaining why his stove was hot. From the living room, the TV announcer laughed at a joke no one answered. Outside, the idling engine held, patient as a form waiting for a signature. Mia stood in the doorway, small and still. She asked if Captain could sleep with her. Cale tucked the loose seam closed with his palm and lifted the rabbit as if it were fragile for reasons Mia didn't need. He told her yes. Captain stayed with her. Then he set the zip bag with the card in a higher cabinet, behind cereal boxes, out of a child's reach and out of casual eyes. The question stayed in the kitchen with him long after he turned the lamp off. If they were watching his house now, how far would they reach into Mia's life to get what they wanted? The knock at noon had no rhythm. 2 taps, a pause, then one more, like someone ticking a box. Cale Ward didn't answer immediately. He held position in the hallway where he could see the front door and the living room at the same time. Mia sat cross-legged on the rug with Captain in her lap. The TV played low. The house smelled like reheated pasta and lemon dish soap. Outside, an engine idled. Not loud, just present. Cale checked the front window first. An official vehicle sat in the driveway. Plain paint, no markings. Government plates. Behind it, at the curb, a second car waited like it was trying not to look like it was waiting. He went to the kitchen cabinet and retrieved the zip bag from behind the cereal boxes. The plastic crinkled softly in his hand. The SD card inside sat flat against the paper towel, tape label still visible through the clear film. KR. He set the bag on the counter under the brightest light. He placed his phone beside it, screen dark. He didn't take pictures yet. Pictures were easy to dismiss. Paper was harder. Mia, he called, without raising his voice. Yeah? Stay right there, he said. Cartoon volume the same. Captain stays with you. Mia nodded like she understood same, even if she didn't understand why. Cale opened the door. A woman stood on the porch. Mid-30s. Hair pulled back tight. Dark jacket over a collared shirt. Her badge was already in her hand, lifted long enough to register, and then lowered again. Mr. Ward, she said. I'm the agent assigned to collect the item. Her voice had the temperature of a waiting room. Cale didn't step us either. He said she was early. I'm on time, she replied. I'm here for the item. He opened the door wider and stepped back just enough to avoid a scene on the porch. He kept his body between her and the living room, Her eyes still flickered past him, fast, trained. She saw Mia. She saw the rabbit. She filed it away without reaction. They moved to the kitchen. The cabinet hinge gave a small complaint when Cale opened it, then settled. He kept the counter between them. The agent stopped at the edge of the light like she didn't want to cast a shadow on the object. "That's it," she said, looking at the zip bag. "That's it," Cale said. "Recovered from my daughter's stuffed rabbit." The agent held out a small evidence kit. Not dramatic. A hard case with foam slots and a stack of pre-printed labels. She set it down and opened it with a soft click. She asked what he did after he found it. Cale kept it short. He didn't insert it into anything. He bagged it with a paper towel. He marked the time. He kept it out of reach. The agent nodded once and produced a chain of custody form. The paper was thick. The sound of it sliding onto the counter was louder than it should have been. "Date and time of recovery," she said. Cale gave it. Her pen scratched in steady strokes. "Location." "Kitchen table," Cale said. "Inside, Captain." "Any other handling?" "No," Cale said. "Not with bare hands." Her pen paused for a beat, then resumed. "Good." Cale watched her write his name like it was a component. The act felt intimate in the wrong way. His life reduced to fields. He asked what happened after she took it. "It gets logged," she said. "It gets preserved. It gets copied under controlled conditions. It gets placed on a legal hold." She didn't explain. She didn't need to. The phrase did the work on its own. The agent tore a label from a sheet and placed it across the zip seal. The sticker crackled as it adhered. She wrote an identifier number in block letters and said it out loud as she wrote it, like speaking, made it real. Cale slid his own notebook across the counter. "I want the number in my copy." The agent's eyes lifted, not irritated, measuring. "We'll note your cooperation," she said, tone unchanged. She handed him the form. "Sign." Cale read every line. He signed once, clean, and wrote the evidence number into his notebook with the same care he'd use for a permission slip. The agent lifted the zip bag. The plastic crinkled. She slid it into an evidence envelope and sealed it. The zipper sound was small and final. Then the envelope went into the hard case. The foam took it without resistance. Cale's stomach tightened anyway. Leverage leaving his hands always felt like a mistake, even when it wasn't. The agent snapped the case shut. The click was quieter than Cale wanted it to be. In the living room, Mia's cartoon laughter rose and fell on cue. Cale realized she was keeping the volume the same because he told her to. Obedience as comfort. The agent looked at Cale as if moving to a second checklist. "Do not speak about this without counsel." Cale's jaw tightened. He said he wasn't looking for a microphone. "Good," she said. "Because others will be." She turned toward the door. At the threshold, she paused, eyes flicking once more toward Mia. "Keep your daughter out of the paperwork," she said, as if it were a neutral instruction instead of a pressure point. Cale didn't answer. He couldn't promise something he couldn't control. She stepped onto the porch. The official vehicle's engine started with a low, smooth turnover. The second car at the curb didn't move. It didn't have to. Presence was enough. Before she got in, the agent added one more line without turning around. "Don't leave town. And if anyone offers you a quiet resolution, assume it comes with a signature." Then she drove away, case on the passenger seat like a sealed container. Cale stood in the doorway until the tires left the driveway. When he turned back into the house, the kitchen looked too clean. The bright light on the counter hit nothing. The hum of it felt louder now. Mia peered around the couch. "Daddy?" Cale forced his voice into normal. "Yeah." "Did Captain do something bad?" Cale sat beside her on the rug. Captain's bent ear brushed his wrist. He kept his hand steady when he smoothed the rabbit's head. "No," he said. "Captain didn't do anything wrong." Mia nodded slowly, but her eyes stayed on his face, searching for the part he wasn't saying. Cale listened to the silence the engine had left behind and felt the weight of the empty counter. The evidence was gone. And whatever happened next would happen in rooms he couldn't enter, on paper he couldn't touch. The call from the school came at 10:17 from a number saved under front office. Cale Ward answered on the second ring. The voice on the line was careful and practiced. Paper shifted in the background, a soft shuffle like someone aligning a stack. "Mia is fine," the school administrator said. "But there's an issue with her enrollment status." Cale's grip tightened around the phone just enough to blanch his knuckles. "Issue how?" "It's showing as pending verification," the administrator said. "Until it clears, she can't remain in class." Cale stared at the wall above his sink. Nothing on it. No photos. No calendar. He'd kept his home uncluttered on purpose. Now the blank space felt like a dare. "That's not possible," he said. "Her records are current." "It may be an administrative error," the administrator replied. "The system flagged it. I'm required to follow policy." Policy made it sound like nobody was choosing this. "Put her on." A pause, then Mia's small voice, quieter than usual. "Hi, Daddy." Cale's tone changed instantly. "Hey, you okay?" "I'm okay," Mia said. "They told me to sit." "Did you do anything wrong?" "No," Mia said fast. "I didn't. I don't know." "You didn't," Cale said. "I'm coming." He drove the way he always drove when he didn't want the day to grow teeth. Careful. Boring. No sudden moves that could become another note in another file. At the school, the parking lot looked ordinary. Parents in hoodies. Kids with backpacks. Normal life doing its job of looking harmless. Inside, the school administrator met him at the front desk with a folder already open, pages clipped in place. The tight smile was practiced. Pleasant delivery, bad news. Mia sat in a plastic chair near the wall, feet dangling. Captain was pressed to her chest, rabbit's ear twisted in her fingers. When she saw Cale, her shoulders dropped in relief, then tensed again when she caught the set of his jaw. Cale crouched. "Hey." Mia leaned into him without words. Her body was warm. Her hands were cold. The administrator cleared her throat and turned a monitor toward him. "Pending verification. Background review required." Cale read it twice. Third grade didn't require background review. Not for a child. Not for recess and spelling tests and pancakes on Saturday. "What generated this?" he asked. The administrator's eyes flicked down to the folder. "It came through the district portal," she said. "It doesn't list an individual sender. It's just a flake. No sender. No signature. No one to call back and pin it to." Mia tugged his sleeve. "Daddy," she whispered. Did Captain make this happen?" Cale turned and forced his face to soften. "No," he said. "Captain didn't do anything." Mia's eyes held water, but she didn't spill it. Confusion, not theatrics. Then why are they doing this? Cale looked back at the screen. "Because the computer says so," he said, hating how small it sounded. The administrator slid a printed page across the counter. The paper was warm, fresh from the printer. The machine behind her whirred, clicked, and went key it again. "This is the policy reference," she said. "And these are the items we need: proof of residency, emergency contact verification, and a supplemental review form." Supplemental. Another harmless word. Cale read the list and saw the lever. Any delay meant Mia sat out. Any missing signature meant non-compliance. A loop designed to grind time into dust. He kept his voice low. "Can she stay today?" "Technically, she should be sent home," the administrator said. "But we can place her in the library temporarily while you resolve it." Quietly. Quietly showed up again like it had a loyalty card. Cale looked down at Mia. She was watching his face like it was the only indicator she trusted. He nodded once. "Library is fine. For today." Mia frowned. "Am I in trouble?" Cale crouched again, bringing his voice into a smaller space. "No, you're not in trouble." Mia's fingers tightened around Captain's ear. "I don't like grown-up stuff." "I know," Cale said. He asked for copies of everything. Not an email summary. Paper. Paper could be carried. Paper could be stamped. Paper could be shown to another human without being lost in the system. The administrator printed. Pages slid into the tray with a dry rasp. District seal. Date line. Blank field waiting for his signature. Outside, in the lot, a dark sedan sat near the exit. It wasn't blocking anything. It didn't need to. It was simply there, like a shape meant to be noticed and never acknowledged. Cale got back in his car and sat for a moment with the documents on the passenger seat. His breathing stayed slow. His jaw ached from holding tension. This was what retaliation looked like when it wore a tie. No punches. Just a policy switch that cost him hours and cost them nothing. He called Kate Ross from the driver's seat. Kate answered on the third ring. Cale kept his voice controlled and told her what happened. School flay. Pending verification. Background review. Kate went silent, then breathed out shakily. She said she was sorry. Cale told her not to be. This was the pattern. Kate said they offered her support again. A Kia track. They said it would protect her. "It protects them," Cale said. Kate's voice steadied. She told them no. Cale looked at the school building, bright and harmless under winter light. Retreating didn't protect Mia. It taught them where to press. Kate asked what they did now. Cale didn't give a speech. He gave a method. They escalated clean. They stayed documented. If someone wanted silence, they made them write the request down. If someone wanted a signature, they made them own the words around it. They did not volunteer quiet. He ended the call and drove home with the documents on the seat like a second passenger. At the kitchen table, he laid the pages out and started a binder. Date. Time. Who said what. He stapled the school notice to the front with a sharp clack that echoed in the empty room. Mia came in that afternoon carrying Captain Ghent. She climbed onto a chair and watched him write. "Daddy," she asked, small and careful, "are we okay?" Cale kept his pen moving as he answered. Ink didn't fix anything, but it made the pressure visible. "We're okay," he said. "We're just not quiet anymore." The question sat between them like an unsigned form. If the system could reach into a school office with a keystroke, where else could it reach next? The meeting room had no windows and no clock. Time showed itself as a low HVAC hum, and the slow skin that formed on coffee left untouched in porcelain. The table was too long for the number of people present, polished to a mirror that reflected fluorescent light without warmth. 8 chairs, 2 occupied. Cale Ward took the seat closest to the door. Not by accident. The chair legs scraped as he drew it in, a soft sound that carried in the sterile air like a breach. He folded his hands once, then separated them and placed his palms flat. He wanted the tremor gone before it could be read. A folder waited in front of him. Heavy cardstock, cream-colored. His name printed cleanly on the tab, a line to the edge. No handwriting, no red ink. This was not discipline. This was processing. The door opened without ceremony. Admiral Hale entered alone. He wore a dark suit, well cut, but unadorned. No uniform, no insignia. If he passed Cale on the street, he would register as a man who worked in offices where decisions happened quietly. Hale nodded once, neither greeting nor challenge, and took the chair opposite. He set a legal pad down, squared it to the table edge, and placed his pen parallel to the margin. The pen made a small click when he uncapped it. Hale thanked Cale for coming, calm and practiced. Cale listened instead of answering. The HVAC cycled. Somewhere beyond the wall, footsteps passed and faded. When Hale opened the folder, paper shifted with a rasp that sounded too loud. Hale said the meeting was informal. No recording devices. No adversarial posture. Cale's eyes flicked once to the ceiling, then back. Then why the forms? Hale did not smile. He adjusted the folder by a fraction. Because informality does not survive scrutiny. He slid the folder across the table. Cardboard rasped on polished wood. Cale opened it and read the first page like he read the receipt at Marlo's. Not for comfort, for leverage. The documents were familiar by structure if not by title. Disposition summaries. Cooperation acknowledgments. Language sanded smooth until it caught on nothing. Charges related to the diner incident would be dropped, Hale said. Cale's pension would remain intact. Medical coverage uninterrupted. Mia's school status would normalize. The words sat on the page like a hand held out. Cale read slowly. Not because he needed time, but because speed made mistakes. Relief offered in clean paragraphs. Each clause placed like a sandbag against future movement. Then he reached the section titled Voluntary Statement of Context. The tone shifted there, subtle as a hinge. Intervention reframed as escalation. Responsibility diffused into passive constructions. Silence described as professionalism. Cale tapped the page once with his index finger. The sound was sharp in the quiet. This says I acknowledge my actions increased public disorder. Hale inclined his head. It provides closure. It provides a narrative, Cale said. Hale folded his hands, pen resting between them. Narratives are unavoidable, he said. The question is, who authors them? Not punishment. Assignment. A signature that would let the institution stand behind paper and call it resolved. You want me as a buffer, Cale said. A civilian who crossed a line so the institution doesn't have to. Hale did not correct him. He said Cale had stopped a bad outcome, and that was noted. But the record did not need to preserve how, only that the matter was resolved and contained. Cale asked what happened to Kate Ross. Hale's pen rolled once under his fingers, then stopped. Her report would proceed within appropriate channels, he said. Careers would be adjusted. Transfers might occur. No public spectacle. And the evidence? Cale asked. Preserved, Hale said. Contained. Cale thought of the zip of an evidence bag, the scratch of a pen on a log sheet. Truth frozen and shelved, still technically present while functionally unreachable. He closed the folder. The sound felt final even though nothing had been signed. You're not here to stop me, he said. You're here to use me. Hale met his gaze evenly. I am here to manage risk, he said. To the institution, to you, to your child. The offer wasn't mercy. It was a trade. Stability for compliance, framed as professionalism. Cale pictured Mia in a plastic chair, feet not touching the floor, captain pressed tight against her chest. He pictured the word pending on a screen. Hale let the silence do work. He said Cale could walk out with this finished. Go back to a quiet life. All he had to do was sign and keep his mouth closed. Cale slid the folder back across the table untouched. I'm not signing, he said. The HVAC hummed. Hale studied him with calculation, as if recalibrating a model that had assumed obedience. If you walk away, Hale said, this becomes less predictable. Cale stood. The chair creaked. Predictable for who? Hale did not answer. Disposition was plain when you stripped it down. It wasn't about what happened. It was about what could be said happened, with signatures attached. The paper didn't have to lie. It only had to steer. At the door, Cale paused. He didn't turn around. You're right about one thing, he said. Narratives are unavoidable, but I don't have to volunteer for yours. He left the folder where it sat, clean and patient. In the corridor outside, the air felt warmer, but not safer. He took out his small notebook and wrote one line. Offered disposition. Refused signature. Time. He closed it and felt the paper edge under his thumb. The gap stayed with him as steady as the HVAC hum. How long would the system tolerate a man who refused to be filed neatly away? Saturday morning returned the way it always had, without apology or announcement. Routine showed up like nothing had changed, and then you noticed the places where it no longer fit. Marlo's diner smelled of coffee and batter. The griddle hissed steadily, a sound that belonged to weekends. Sunlight slipped through the front windows and settled into the booth by habit, catching the edge of the table without glare. The bell over the door made its thin, familiar ring, and Cale Ward felt his body register it the way it registered a knock. He slid into the vinyl seat across from Mia. The material stuck briefly to his forearm before releasing. He did not rush it, especially in public. Mia climbed in and set Captain beside her plate. She handled the rabbit differently now, like she knew he had once been more than a toy. The stitching along one seam was new, neat but visible if you knew where to look. It's still Saturday, she said, more statement than question. It's still Saturday, Cale agreed. Pancakes arrived. Syrup followed. The waitress refilled coffee without asking and moved on. No one looked twice at them. That more than any official outcome, was what Cale wanted for Mia, a room that didn't stare. He watched the diner anyway, hands lifting mugs, phones staying in pockets, the counter mirror giving him angles. Habit, and he didn't pretend it would vanish. Mia poured syrup with focused care. They said my school thing fixed itself, she said. The front office administrator said the computer caught up. Cale lifted his mug and let the steam hit his face. Computers like to pretend they're in charge, he said. He kept the tone light because Mia listened harder when he sounded normal. Mia studied him over the rim of her glass. You're not tight today, she said. Cale paused. Kids noticed posture before language. Maybe I learned where to put it, he said. Kate Ross didn't join them. She wouldn't. Not here. Cale had learned enough through channels that never put anything in writing. Quiet transfers. Early retirements framed as opportunities. The institution adjusting without admitting it needed to. After breakfast, Cale paid with cash and kept the receipt without thinking. Paper had become reflex. Proof of place and time, folded crisp in his pocket. On the drive home, Mia hummed to herself and stroked Captain's ear. Cale kept his hand steady on the wheel and let the normal sounds play out. Turn signal tick, tires over seams in the road. He didn't call it peace. He called it a window. Back home, the porch boards were cool under his shoes. The afternoon was thin and bright, the kind of light that made flaws visible. A railing board had worked loose again, the same spot that always did when weather changed. Cale fetched a screwdriver and tightened it until the wood stopped complaining. The fix wasn't perfect. It held. He heard Mia inside, moving quietly with Captain. No cartoon now. Just the soft shuffle of socks on floor, like she was trying not to disturb him. His phone buzzed once in his pocket. Kate's name lit the screen. Cale answered without speaking for a beat, listening for background. Wind, distant traffic, the edge of a parking lot. Kate chose places where walls couldn't lean in. She's okay? Kate asked. She's okay, Cale said. Back in class. Kate let out a breath like she'd been holding it since the diner. They said the enrollment flag was an error, she said. Like it just happened. Cale looked at the screwhead in the railing, bright in sunlight. Errors don't have timing, he said. A pause. Then Kate's voice steadied. They moved him, she said. No hearing. No press. Just gone. No name. No details. Kala didn't ask. Asking made things bigger. That's how it works, Cale said. I wanted to say thank you, Kate said, for not letting them make it disappear. Mia stepped onto the porch. Captain's ear looped around her fingers. She looked from him to the phone, then back. It didn't disappear, Cale said. It just stopped being loud. When he hung up, Mia sat on the steps beside him with Captain between them. The rabbit's fur brushed Cale's wrist. Ordinary again, if you didn't know where to look. Mia tiltede her head. Are you done fighting? She asked. Cale wiped his hands on a rag and sat so his shoulder touched hers. The porch wood was cool through his jeans. I wasn't fighting, he said. I was keeping a promise. What promise? Mia asked. That I wouldn't let anyone tell you you were wrong when you weren't, he said. Mia leaned into him, satisfied. She turned Captain's bent ear between her fingers like it was a worry stone. Can we be normal now? She asked. Cale looked out at the street. A car passed and kept going. The world moved like it always did. We can be normal, he said. We just keep our rules. He tightened one last screw, felt the railing stop shifting under his palm, and sat there with Mia and Captain until the light changed and nobody asked them to sign anything.